Pokemon Pocket's Mythical Island expansion is dropping in a few days. Let's take a look at all of the leaked cards that we know will be in this expansion and talk about how they might impact the Pokemon Pocket metagame. First up is Mew EX. With 130 HP, this basic EX Pokemon has a decent amount of bulk. 130 is a pretty solid breakpoint. It also has two attacks. The first is Psyshot, going for 20, and the second is Genome Hacking, a 3 colorless energy attack that simply copies one of your opponent's attacks. This card is probably the card that I've seen the most people getting the most excited about. It looks like a very dangerous revenge killer, the kind of card that can instantly come in and deal with an opposing Mewtwo EX, deal with an opposing Charizard EX. And I think a lot of what is good in Pokemon Pocket right now is the kind of stuff that is weak to Mew EX and what it can do with that genome hacking ability. However, there is a bit of a potential downside here. And by potential downside, I guess I should say there's one elephant in the room, or maybe a little bit of a rat in the room, and that is Pikachu EX. While this card does seem like it likely has a niche in terms of revenge killing Mewtwo EX, revenge killing Charizard EX, cards like Pikachu EX, Pikachu EX's Circle Circuit, you can't copy that effectively because it scales off the number of electric Pokemon on the bench. And so there's a very clearly defined weakness that this card has, and it is called Pikachu EX. The way this card is set up, it reminds me almost a little bit of Zapdos EX. We have a basic EX Pokemon with a decent chunk of HP, 2 attacks, one that attacks minimally for 1 energy, and one that attacks much more heavily for 3 energy, and of course a 1 retreat cost. This feels like the kind of Pokemon that will be good, but I think it's going to be more similar to a Zapdos EX, where it's like this is part of something that you're doing, or like a specific tech card for certain situations, rather than its own archetype specifically. I expect it to be around, but I think people are a little too high on this, mostly because of the very stark Pikachu EX weakness. This card generally is better the better your opponent's attacks are into them, right? And so Pikachu EX isn't the only thing that's not very amazing to attack. Like, for example, something like Exeggutor EX is pretty reasonable into this. Something where it's like the bulk of the investment that you're making into the Pokemon is due to like something other than the specific attack. And right now, the sort of shape of the major Pokemon that see play, or several of the major Pokemon that see play, is just very heavy hitter that is going to one-shot everything, and that's what this card is good against. So I think it's going to provide a decent counterbalance in the metagame to that stuff. The very heavy hitter that one-shots everything archetype is definitely going to get weaker for the existence of this card, but there is a huge worry in my head that Pikachu EX is just going to beat the living crap out of this. And so I'm not sure if it's going to really have legs. I think the nightmare scenario would be this deck makes both Mewtwo EX worse because it is beating up Mewtwo's, and Charizard EX worse, and then suddenly you have Pikachu EX beating the crap out of this, and there's less of the Mewtwo EX build with Mewtwo that is actually reasonable into Pikachu EX. That would be the nightmare scenario that this card could cause. I'm excited for it, but the very prominent weakness to not being able to copy Circle Circuit functionally is very scary to me. Next up is Aerodactyl EX, a 140 HP fighting type that evolves, of course, from Old Amber. A lot of the hype around Aerodactyl EX is based on its ability Primeval Law. Primeval Law says that your opponent cannot evolve their basic Pokemon, or I guess stage 1 Pokemon as well, if it's in the active spot by playing a card from hand, which currently in Pokemon TCG Pocket is the only way to evolve a Pokemon. So this is effectively a way of making sure that your opponent cannot get major scaling threats onto the board. Here's the problem. It doesn't work on the bench, which means this is the kind of card that really wants to be paired with, at minimum, Sabrina, and maybe some other stuff in order to try to actually make it make sense. The other thing that really sticks out to me about this Pokemon, though, is that it actually compares fairly reasonably to Starmie EX. It's not a perfect comparison, but we all know how good Starmie EX is as a Stage 1 EX Pokemon that, very crucially, attacks for 90 with 2 energy and has 130 HP. Aerodactyl EX attacks for 80 with 2 energy and has 140 HP. I would say this would be comparably good to Starmie EX if it wasn't an Old Amber Evolver. The worry I have for this card is very specifically related to Old Amber. Because Old Amber is not actually a basic Pokemon, you do not have the guaranteed ability to get it in your opening hand that you could if it was a basic Pokemon. You do not have the ability to play Pokeball and get an Old Amber. And I worry that that kind of issue will make this card worse than what it could otherwise be compared to. I think also the fact that where normal Aerodactyl is purely colorless, this Aerodactyl has an actual typing, that's also a little bit of a weakness. We don't want this card to be weak to electric, and I understand that Pokemon TCG Pocket is a little bit simplified. But if I recall correctly, in the games, Aerodactyl is rock flying, and one of those types is weak to electric, and the other one isn't, and they went with the one that was weak to electric, and I feel like I've already talked about the yellow rat in the room with talking about Pikachu EX, but it matters here, like, it's weak to electric. Great, awesome. I'm gonna get 110'd by a circle circuit and then get blitzeled to death or something. Like, this is not a great situation to be in when you are an EX Pokemon that is already a little bit less reliable because of being Old Amber. I also think if I had to guess, I would guess that I am way more excited for the stat line and the power here than I am for the ability Primeval Law. I think Primeval Law is going to be like more of an add-on than a specific thing for this deck or for this card. And I think the decks that run this are going to be running it just for it being a good 140 that hits for 80 with limited energy. That's going to be what this card is about. I feel like it's going to be about its numbers rather than about its ability. The ability is cool, but most of the time when people are doing this, they're building up on the bench. And so it's going to be more about like, okay, it allows me to get some really sick Sabrina things that win games. And I do think that matters. Like, having a thing that just like gives you free wins of even a small amount of the time, you take those. But really what this card is going to be about for me, I think, is going to be the 140 and the 80 and the 2 energy. We also got a new Vaporeon with an ability called Washout that I think is actually definitely the main draw of this Pokemon. It allows you to move any amount of energy you want, water energy, from your benched Pokemon to your active Pokemon. This level of energy redistribution is very interesting given that water is the type that gets Misty. And so you have this ability to turn your Misty high rolls into even more ridiculousness. What I am sort of interested in is, does this enable anything that isn't Misty? Because, you know, 120 is very reasonable bulk in terms of HP, but 3 energy for 60 damage is frankly very, very, very low. And so we need a good reason to be playing this, and that reason would have to be the ability. And I need to figure out exactly what this could let me do. Obviously, it seems like the kind of thing that is good, but energy redistribution is not the same thing as energy generation. And energy generation feels like it's always going to be a little bit stronger. If I'm winning some Misty coin flips, I'm usually just going to win off of that and not necessarily need to redistribute. I can see this card being useful in the context of maybe a Blastoise deck, where you're looking to have some early game aggression and then redistribute your energy to the Blastoise later. That's the kind of thing where I think this card could make sense. But with only 20 slots in the deck, I find it hard to imagine that I'm going to be able to fit in some early aggression, the full Blastoise evolution line, and also Eevee and Vaporeon in order to make this actually be a cohesive deck. That seems like it's just going to take up way too many slots. It's possible, but like, let's say we do Staryu, Starmie, that's 4. The Blastoise evolution line is 6. Eevee, Vaporeon, that's another 4. Suddenly we're at 14 Pokemon, and that doesn't seem like there are so many required trainers. We're giving stuff up to run 14 Pokemon. It doesn't make a ton of sense. And then when you look at the actual water decks people play, they're already very efficient in terms of energy usage. Like, you have your Starmie EXs, you have your Articuno EXs, you just Misty stuff onto those and then just blow people away. This doesn't really seem like it goes there. This is another card that I'm seeing a lot of hype for, but I'm not actually able to figure out where it makes sense in practice. If anyone is able to like give me a good example of like if this effect is good in the TCG or something, because I don't play the Pokemon TCG. This is really my first exposure to the game. So maybe I'm pretty out of touch with this, but I'm not really seeing what the hype is here. Dedenne is here in Mythical Island, and I think it looks a lot like Pincurchin, which is already a card that sees a lot of play in the Pikachu EX decks. Every basic Pokemon that electric type gets is something that will have to be considered for Pikachu EX decks. Pincurchin requires 2 energy to start paralyzing. Dedenne only requires 1, but it is still a fairly interesting card, even though it does less damage on its paralysis attack and has less HP. I think that the argument for Dedenne is that really when you play it, all you're trying to do is stall out anyway with Pincurchin or Dedenne, and so you're pretty much fine doing whatever it is you have to do when you play this card. You'd rather just do it with the least energy investment possible, and that makes Dedenne a better Pincurchin. I'm not positive that's true, but I can totally see that argument. Of the cards we've talked about thus far, this one feels like it has the clearest home for us to figure out if it's actually going to be better than Pincurchin, if that 1 energy is going to be more impactful long term, or if we really would rather care about the extra damage that we get out of Pincurchin alongside the extra HP. This one is pretty straightforward. It might be better Pincurchin, it might be worse Pincurchin, but that is very clearly the comparison, and that is very clearly the card slot that it is competing for. Blue, our rival from the very first Pokemon video games, has made it here, and he is Reverse Giovanni, effectively. Very cool flavoring, given the lore, I suppose. Being Reverse Giovanni, I think, unfortunately, is a little bit worse than being Giovanni for a couple of reasons. The first is Giovanni is a surprise. Blue, once you play him, your opponent knows he is happening. There are going to be situations where I think this card is going to blow people out. Being able to modify breakpoints has been very important in Pokemon TCG Pocket so far. The game has been very much about the breakpoints you hit. Sometimes you need that extra turn, and sometimes this card will give you that extra turn in a guaranteed way. I think that this is also going to be a very hard card to play. Not only because of what it does, but also because Giovanni exists. So you need to be able to be willing to play around Giovanni with this and say, like, look, I'm investing blue here so that I don't get, X plus Giovanni next turn. That stuff's really scary because a lot of the time what you'll want to do, like let's say you're just trying to build up to a certain breakpoint so you can like get a kill in, right? You need to be able to be willing to make that call, because if you invest that to prevent a Giovanni killing your thing and they don't have a Giovanni, you wasted your blue. But if you don't invest it and they do have a Giovanni, you never get a chance to play your blue. This seems like a very difficult card to play to me. And if I had to guess, I would say where Giovanni is a staple, blue is going to be perhaps somewhat less than that. This is also a card that I think has potential to make me look stupid for saying what I just said. This feels like a card that once you play it, you'll get a good sense for what it can do. And also it feels like a card that in specific situations is absolutely going to win you games. I just think it'll probably do that at a lower rate than Giovanni. Where Giovanni is a staple, this card will end up being a little more specific. More lull has been leaked, which does mean that we're likely to get Shiinotic. I don't know why I said likely there. It wouldn't make it not evolve. Come on, that seems ridiculous. But obviously, I can't confirm that we're getting Shiinotic because that hasn't been leaked. I think we can pretty reasonably assume that, however. 60 HP with a 20 damage, 1 energy ram attack. This is a fairly standard basic Pokemon, but I do think that 60 HP is worth noting. 50 HP is the worst of the possible options. I'm very happy when I see basics with 60 and above, because it means they are far less vulnerable to the fairly common 40 plus Giovanni lines. Snivy is weirding me out. Like, I don't understand why they gave it the exact Bulbasaur stat line, but I really hope that they do something more to differentiate from the Bulbasaur line here. Snivy through Superior is like a really cool evolution line, and I don't like that the first one of them is functionally identical to Bulbasaur. And I think that that is something that has been on my mind the more I think about this kind of expansion for a game like this, especially with lower basic Pokemon. There's gonna be repeats like this. It's just going to happen a lot of the time because there's only so many options you can really put on a basic. It's gonna be, 40 to 70 HP. It's going to have an attack that costs 1 to 2, and it's going to do somewhere between, 10 to 40 damage. Like, there's only so many combinations you can do. It just is kind of jarring that the grass starters get the same exact stat line. We're getting a new Execute, which is weird, I think, especially given what this Execute does. Getting extra energy does very little for most Exeggutor, every Exeggutor in the game, really. Like, Exeggutor right now is being played as a card that you don't have to invest energy in because all of its attacks do 1. You attach 1 here, you are then investing into having the greater ability to retreat. It doesn't make a ton of sense. In addition, we've talked about the 50 HP being very, very unfortunate because of those 40 plus Giovanni things. 50 HP for something that doesn't actually attack is just a very scary proposition that is a fragile egg to run out there. What I'm wondering about is if this means we're getting, maybe a Alolan Exeggutor or something, or an Exeggutor that actually wants you to have energy attached to it. Because as is, I don't really see a use for this card, and that implies that there might be a use for it that we haven't gotten access to yet. I don't think Delm is very amazing. It's basically just grass-type Lapras, but I am glad that grass is getting more just like, here's a big basic. I feel like grass has mostly lacked that access to that kind of thing. And while I don't expect Delm to do a ton of incredible stuff in the metagame, I am glad that, I talked about with like the Snivy stuff where it's like, okay, there's limited spaces for this. The basic that doesn't really do anything other than be a big basic and have some stats on it, Grass didn't really have a lot of those, and I'm glad they have one now. I don't think it's going to be very good, but I'm glad they're filling the space that the archetype has allowed them to fill. A new Magmar with 80 HP and a 2 energy Fire Blast that does 80 and requires discarding of 2 energy from the Magmar. I am not sure this is going to really go anywhere, but I do think it has a greater appeal than the current Magmar that exists, because the only deck that would ever really consider playing Magmar is the Blaine Hyper Aggro deck. The downside of this is not overwhelmingly relevant because you're really only using it one time ever. Because this is a basic, it just sits in hand. But also because this is a basic, you can end up with some real trouble because the Blaine aggro deck is so reliant on like Vulpix Ninetales, which is basically, Ninetales is just basically a better version of this Pokemon. And so you end up sacrificing consistency at getting to Ninetales by running a basic, because now your Pokeballs will get this instead. Your opening hand could have this instead. And if you have an opening hand, which with just this and like no other basics, you basically aren't doing anything. I feel like I'm saying the word basic a lot. I think this card is better than current Magmar in the Blaine deck, probably, but also is so much worse than Ninetales that I'm not sure I'd ever really want to run it. Larvesta looks really interesting to me. Obviously, this Pokemon's viability is going to be determined by how good Volcarona is, but 80 HP basic, attacking for 30, I mean, like, we've talked about the ability that something like Centiskorch has to be good. We've talked about how good Arcanine EX has been. If Volcarona is a good carrier of Moltres EX energy, this could be a real threat. Like, there's been a lot of debate about fire Pokemon generally, but basically all of the ones that are good carriers of Moltres EX energy are at least playable. And this has the best body of all of the basics, making it a very solid setup. Downside to retreat cost, so if you get it Sabrina'd out there, you can be in trouble. But this does have some legitimate appeal, I think, with that size of a body. Tauros is a pretty interesting card. It's not the exact kind of anti-Pokemon EX tech I would have wanted in the game right now. And I think specifically the breakpoint that it hits at, 120, is a little bit awkward because so many Pokemon EXs end up being at like 130 plus. If this card was hitting for like 150 against a Pokemon EX, I would say this is like clearly one of the best cards in the set. It's definitely not doing that, and I don't know if it's going to actually make waves because of that, but I do like that there is some push to push back on the dominance of Pokemon EX in this format, because I've seen so many tournaments where they're just like, I really hate all these Pokemon EX, let's just ban all the Pokemon EX. And obviously that won't ever really happen, but it does show that there's an appetite for people to play without the Pokemon EX in the game. I personally think that the game is probably a lot more interesting and dynamic when it's battling to 3 in increments of 1, rather than just being about let's blow up the Pokemon EX. That let's blow up the Pokemon EX meta is part of what makes Mewtwo and Charizard so good right now, because they're the best things at popping other EX Pokemon. And that, I think, is a dynamic that isn't overwhelmingly, I'm not saying it's not overwhelmingly fun, but I do think that there's more depth to this game system than people realize, and a lot of that depth is being covered up by the fact that it's, there's so many Pokemon EXs that the game just becomes about popping them. And so I wonder about a card like this, if it's possible to bring a true one prize deck into the meta. I don't know that it is. I kind of doubt it. The EX Pokemon are really strong, but I am glad that they are at least providing options to try to deal with them. I just wish this one did a little more damage to Pokemon EX. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. I hope you're as excited about Mythical Island as I am. My plan currently is on Monday to do a tier list video entering Mythical Island, and then next Monday, we'll do a tier list video after Mythical Island to see what's actually changed. I will also probably do another one of those I spend $100 videos, because I'm stupid and I love wasting money. If you'd like to support my money wasting, please remember to like and subscribe. As always, I've been KM Pocket, aka KM Best, and I'll see you in the next one.